I'm Shannon Merriweather, and I'm an education specialist with the Equity and Cultural Responsiveness team.
And I'm Kristen Hayner, the Neurodiversity Educational Specialist, also with the Equity and Cultural Responsiveness team.
So the last time we were together, we started to talk about what typicality looks like in our classrooms, and that led us to like the next question, which is really like, what do we value in our learning spaces? What do we value in our educational spaces? And as I was thinking about this question, like the next idea that came to me was also that like I think that there are some assumptions that we all value the same things. Like this notion of, I want my kid to be on the National Honor Society. Like that's the goal for all kids. The notion that like, I want my kid to go to college, that's the goal for all kids. Even like, I think we're having some conversations around like, well, I value humanity and I want my child to be seen as a human. Yes, super important, but like, I don't know, what if the family does really value like, no, I want my kid to be like academically excellent, right? And so it just has me thinking like, what are the values that show up in our different educational spaces? And I think that gets at a lot of what we see in terms of what makes this so difficult is we're not all moving towards the same goal line. And I think there are certain goal lines that have been prioritized over others. And also sometimes the idea that like, in order to value humanity, I have to give up excellence.
That's exactly where you had me thinking just now, and I wanted you to tell me more about your thoughts around this. It's because as you were naming the being human-centered versus academic excellence versus maybe building social emotional coping skills, whatever it might be, I know for me, even in that moment, I was tending to gravitate towards binary thinking. It's either or. It's either this or it's that.
Yeah.
And I'd love, because I feel like you were starting to go there, I'd love for you to tell me more about your thoughts around what typically happens when in the system, when it feels like it has to, maybe sometimes it feels like it has to be one or the other, because that is all the energy I have or all I can control.
Right.
And I'm just curious of your thoughts about kind of that notion of it's got to be either this or that, or how do we maybe take like a blended approach to it?
Well, I think about the fact that, so what we know is that educational spaces, education as an enterprise was not created for all kids, right? Like when our public education system was created, it was created for white middle-class males, right? Many of the ways in which...
Neurotypical,
yes. Many of the ways in which we do education are still really antiquated in those ways, right? And so like, we know that schools weren't created for everyone. And what we have done is we have tried to adapt systems, recreate systems. A few years ago, we were using the word reimagine systems, right? So that we can be more inclusive. Right? Like that's the goal, like inclusivity. And part of that in some spaces became, well, like the way to be inclusive is to not put high priority on standardized testing, because we know standardized testing is like racist, and so like we can't expect Black and brown kids to do well on it. So like, let's just not have that as an expectation. Well, I don't know, like what if I want to go to a school that requires the SAT? And so while centering humans, like humanizing school is important because we know that schools aren't created for everyone, we can't forget though that the goal is that flourishing in the way you want it to be and in the way your family wants you to flourish. And so if my family wants me to flourish in college, then I need to be prepared to do that, right? That does require you to see me as a human such that like, if you are a person who is an external processor. You need to be in a space where like people are okay with you talking and externally processing and putting all of that out, right? Like you might not be the writer. And so we need to humanize the space. And so like, if we think about, again, like typicality, certain ways of being in our classrooms are valued.
Right.
We value compliance. And so we value when we give kids directions and they say okay and they do what we tell them to do. We don't value when kids say, I'm sorry, why do you want me to do that? Like, no, I value compliance, right? And like, why do I see it as a problem? And so this idea of what's valued in education, we try to narrow it down to like really concrete, quantitative measures and outcomes. But it's when we start to unpack all of the different values that show up in these spaces that we get at the complexity of it. Because in the end, it isn't just one standardized outcome that's valued. And we have to name the fact that like we haven't mastered the ways in which to get that excellent outcome for all kids. And rather than saying, well, we haven't mastered it, so let's just humanize them. We have to say, well, let's humanize them so that we can master it.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that reframe. Something too that I think I'm pulling out from this as well is that's a very real point of tension, is how to balance this want, desire to humanize and make that the center of your focus and what you value and how your students show up every day. And also, how can you, as an educator, how are you showing up every day into those spaces with the tension of like, that is also in terms of our system, educational, public education at large even, that the value is the output or the achievement or, so I often hear like, yes, of course, that's what we want. And in our real conditions in which we exist, how do we fight against this system that does value the academic outcomes, state testing, benchmarks? And how do I navigate both?
Well, and you saying that has me thinking, even when we try to like broaden the box, what we do is also like really narrow in on the ways in which the thing we've said we value leaves people out. So I think about our goals and our drive, rightfully so, to like insert greater opportunities for students to express what they know in our classrooms. And that's super important for kids to be able to articulate why they know something, how they came at learning something. Because it's more than just, I know 3 times 3 is 9, but how do you know that? So that you don't one day decide that 3 times 3 is 7, right? You have something a foundation there to hold on to. And if English is not my first language, already I'm left out of that box. If I'm super anxious and just don't feel comfortable talking in this environment, I'm already left out of that box. And so even when we have shifted from maybe not holding such a high premium on standardized testing, but I'm going to give you ways to show your thinking, we've now said that this is the way to show what you know. And what about the kids for whom that doesn't work?
Right.
Like and now there's a whole bucket of kids here that have become a problem, right? Like now they don't fit in the box and they don't get access to advanced opportunities because now I've decided that explaining my thinking is the best way to do it. And there are a lot of really capable kids who, for a whole lot of reasons, that might not be their thing, right?
Yeah.
And so when it has me thinking that like we have to have values, right? But like when we hold our values at the premium, that's where we lose the human.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So like if I go back to compliance, we were having this conversation, right? Like if I value compliance, I forget the fact that like this kid's 13 and developmentally he's supposed to like not use a lot of words. He's supposed to probably roll his eyes. Like on his best day, he's not the most relational of people.
Sure.
But if all I'm putting at the top is compliance, then he's a problem.
Yes.
But if I put him here, I'm going to let you maybe roll your eyes and walk past and be like, yep, you're 13 and I still love you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But I can still hold this value of, I need you to be kind, and I can still teach that while understanding that like in this moment, you might not demonstrate it, but that doesn't make you less than.
Ooh, yet. The power of
yeah.
yet.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm visualizing, because you kept referring to these students, and now I'm thinking of those students who, because of the way in which those conditions were presented to them or how their environment was designed, who aren't able to access, not because they can't or they're unable to or they're unintelligent or unworthy, which is often the perceived message that is received, as opposed to this idea of the yet. This structure, this approach has not worked for you, and that is not reflective of your capability, your worth, intelligence. And I think the way in which what you were describing is that how things have typically been done is that if you don't fit into this box, then we've got to figure out something else, what to do with you, because you aren't meeting XYZ. And instead of interrogating the conditions in which that is happening, we, as you said, we problematize the individual for not adapting to their environment when their environment wasn't built for them. And so I think another part of this conversation is like the implications that fall out from assumptions that are made of what we value or what we don't value. Because if this is what is perceived to be held as the standard or a value, and I don't meet that, what does that say about me? But we exist. It's just such a, I'm like, now I'm thinking about all the complexities and nuances of all of those different ways of being.
So a couple years ago, I was working with a school, and I used this example. I have 2 children. They are lovely young men, and they have some privileges, right? Like they have an educated mother. Like if you think about like all of the factors and all of the variables that are often associated with student success, right? Like decent median household income, things of that nature, right? You would look at them on paper and you would say, I expect them to be successful. I expect them to do well in school. For the most part, they do. They have a pretty low frustration tolerance. Perseverance is a struggle for them, I would say in part because things have come easily for them. And yet on paper, they're valuable in the school. They can do the things. They have all of those really grounding features, characteristics that one would expect for student success. Additionally, we have students who come to our schools as unaccompanied minors. They have come from other countries without their parents, without knowing where they're going to be. And I would argue the perseverance and background knowledge that those children bring to our schools are things that my children will never possess. Amazingly so. And yet, they come to our schools and they are viewed as empty buckets. Because they don't come with the things that we value. Ready to do school in the right ways, knowing the ways in which school functions, knowing what's expected.
English proficiency sometimes too.
Well, and even like, oh, I'm supposed to sit here in the carpet and listen to you in a language I don't understand, but the expectation is for me to sit here for the next 20 minutes. Okay, I don't really understand why, but I'll do it, right? And so, like, there are so many things that we have students coming to our classrooms with that aren't valued and functioning, in a system that prioritizes and values excellence, right? Like if that's the end game. And so how do we mix that? Like, I need to see you for who you are and what you are bringing, which is also probably a world of experiences that, again, I can't even fathom.
Yeah.
While also guaranteeing that you will be excellent should you want to be in whatever you want to be, right? Like that my goal is not simply your survival.
Right.
It's Bettina Love, right? We want to do more than just survive.
Right.
We want to be amazing. We want to flourish.
Yeah.
But I have to, at first, to be able to see that those things that you are bringing are valuable.
And that's a huge mindset shift, because something you're also addressing is that historically, the system education has operated from that compliance piece where I am banking information into you for you to regurgitate information or skills, but our world is changing.
Yeah.
And now we're in education shifting to this mindset of I am not the holder of information. I am thinking more of an approach of like being the facilitator of building you as a thinker, as a problem solver, as a lot of those portrait of a graduate skills.
Absolutely.
And so we're kind of in the middle of this shift, which I don't think there are many opportunities to talk about, is how can I realistically start to make some of those shifts in any educational space where I'm not just the regurgitator of knowledge, but I'm valued for my own intellect, way of thinking and being. Because typically, that going back to that output being valued, how are we also considering how the landscape is changing about where our students are going to be entering post-graduation? And that's really, it's just such a hard place. I grapple with it all the time. It's like, how do you go into these spaces of the real current realities? And then we're talking up here as like almost this desired state, this utopia. And how do we start to integrate, I don't want to presume, I know that it's currently being done, but as like common practice. How are we shifting that narrative so that we're not boxing students in and therefore reinforcing that you're smart or not smart, a mathematician, not a mathematician, like these binary ways of ability?
Well, and I think that that's the thing, right? Like it's the binary, because even when I think about how do we lead with student voice and student-led, student-centered learning spaces, that doesn't beget that the adults aren't necessary, right? Like children, young people still need adults. Like the adults if the adult wasn't needed and the child could just sit in the classroom and like lead themselves to do all the learning, like we wouldn't be paying all of this money for the adults, right? Like they serve a purpose. But but in many ways it's become this binary, like like this notion that like student-led begets that we don't need the adults at all. No, we do, but we have to figure out what that nuance in the middle is. Again, we're figuring out the humans to say, what is it that you need from me? Like what is the learning that you need in this environment? And so it's not one or the other. It's not you are a mathematician or you're not a mathematician, but it's like, how are you interacting with the math, right? Because we also can't have this like, everybody is the same level of amazing at math. Like that's not fair. What if I don't care? What if I love to draw? I don't care about numbers.
And that being okay, that you don't care about numbers.
Yeah, like give me the numbers that I need to get through. But what I really want to do is this thing over here, right? Like I have no desire to be a mathematician. Is that okay? But again, it's that binary. It's that either or, what's the thing that we value instead of who's the person. And with that, we say thank you again for joining us in this space.
And we look forward to seeing you next time.